We don't believe, for instance, in the so-called guarantees for minority rights.
Acclaimed U.S. human rights activist, the Reverend Sharpton will today deliver the 20th annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture. Biko died on this day in 1977 while in the custody of apartheid police. He played a pivotal role in empowering and mobilizing black South Africans around the ideologies of black self-determination and pride. With the emergence of various campaigns, including the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement, do Biko's ideals represent an idea whose time has come? SABC reporter Natasha Piri takes us down memory lane.
Raised from humble beginnings in the Eastern Cape, a young, bright Stephen Bantu Biko's future was one that had promise. At an early age, he got involved in activism and joined the National Union of South African Students, playing a crucial role in forming the South African Students Organization, and was elected as the movement's first president. SASO's goal was aimed at spreading black consciousness amongst the black community and other organizations. However, Bantu Biko posed a huge threat to the apartheid regime, and in 1977 he was arrested. On the 12th of September, Biko died from injuries he sustained in police detention. The 30-year-old suffered multiple injuries and a brain hemorrhage. But over 4 decades after his death, against the excess of the apartheid regime, the country is still haunted by the ghosts of police brutality. The massacre in Marikana, where minors died at the hands of the police, and most recently, yet another death. 16-year-old Nathaniel Julies died at the hands of the police.
Police brutality is a reflection of our failure to help heal the wounds that make police people, public servants in different spheres, to commit the kind of corruption, brutality, and violence that they do, because they don't respect themselves, nor do they have the self-confidence to discharge their responsibilities as servants of the people.
Biko's ideologies and messages of black consciousness have found renewed expression today through the emergence of global campaigns such as the Black Lives Matter movement that have brought a sharp focus on the continued oppression of black people. Most recently, controversial hair advert by the hair and beauty retail company Clicks led to protests against the company. The advert classified black women's hair as dry and damaged, while white women's hair was labeled as normal and fine.
26 years later in our democracy, we are having a good progressive constitution as it is widely acclaimed. We do have legislations, but we still have the apartheid geography. We still have incidents of racism such as the one of cliques and the ones that have come before from individuals, as well as institutionalized racism. So the ideas of Steve Biko, which focused on the consciousness of our mind and creating and cultivating critical consciousness, is what we ought to have infused in our education system, in our political education.
Biko's family says they will continue to educate society on the values their father stood for.
Our focus soon became that of ensuring that if the wish was to ensure that the ideas of Steve Biko and his legacy does not multiply, that in fact that wish is not granted. And so for many, many years, that's what we have done as best we can. And at some point, with the establishment of the foundation, it was more formalized. I must add that that journey has, of course, happened alongside many, many people. And one of those people that we should recognize is the late advocate George Bizos.
Although Biko may be no more, his legacy of black consciousness and pride resonates sharply in this current epoch, an idea whose time appears to have finally come. Natasha Piri, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Still on Steve Biko, the name Stephen Bantu Biko still resonates globally. But the man and his groundbreaking ideas had humble beginnings in the Eastern Cape, where he was born and raised. The man and his conscience was formed on the dusty streets of Ginsberg in King Williamstown, where he now lies buried. He played a vital role in the struggle against apartheid, but also for the people of Ginsberg in life and now in death. Abongile Yankees filed this report.
We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people.
Remembering Steve Biko, anti-apartheid activist, philosopher and leader. The circumstance surrounding his death remains unclear to this day. He died in police custody after being beaten and interrogated. Now, 43 years later, the wounds have still not healed, especially for his family.
The month of September, and in particular the day of the 12th of September, is when, of course, we bow our heads in recognition of his death, having been tortured in Port Elizabeth and transported to Pretoria.
A series of events have been planned this month to honor the legacy of Steve Biko.
We have a virtual Steve Biko month taking place in our social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and the Steve Biko Foundation website. Through that is where we get to express what Biko was able to accomplish and is still accomplishing in his life and in his afterlife.
The home of Steve Biko was declared a heritage site in 1997 by former President Nelson Mandela. Abongile Yankees, SABC News, Ginsberg.
Tomorrow, a U.S. civil rights activist, Reverend Al Sharpton, will deliver the Steve Biko lecture. Reverend Al Sharpton has been leading marches in the United States of America. The lecture comes at a time where the debate on Black Lives Matter and racism is still raging. Earlier, we spoke to Reverend Al Sharpton and asked him for his thoughts ahead of tomorrow's lecture.
Well, I want to share that we across the African diaspora, wherever Africans are, continue a struggle. It is not a new struggle. It manifests itself every generation in new ways, but it is the struggle that is continual. And I remember in my younger days that there was no one more heroic to us than Steve Biko. The Black consciousness movement that he led and personified paralleled the Black Power movement here in the States. And until we begin to understand and appreciate who we are and our magnificent history, as well as what has been endowed in us, we will always accept oppression. We will accept the inhuman behavior, whether it be economically, politically, or whether it is in our relations one to another. And that is what I'm going to lecture about, is that once you become conscious in the way Steve Biko advocated, you will no longer shoot your brother, whether it's in townships in South Africa or whether it's in what we call ghettos in the United States. You will not accept brutalization by law enforcement, whether it is putting their knee on your neck, as in the case of George Floyd, or shooting you in the back, as in the case that has happened here in the States. You will, in Kenosha, you will stand up because you have already stood up psychologically, embrace your culture, embrace your roots, embrace who you are. So it is across the Atlantic that we must connect and reconnect and reignite this movement of self-consciousness and identity and demand no less than our freedom, which includes our land, which includes our political power and our ability to sustain our people.
All right, another transatlantic struggle is racism. Whilst the circumstances may be slightly different in America and South Africa, we do find ourselves in countries and in a world where the laws might be fine, but the lived experience continues to be black people feeling racism. How do we address that in a modern age such as the one we're living in?
We must go from symbolism to substance. We have seen the political advancement in South Africa, but the economic advancement is still the challenge. We've seen in the United States a black president that we've elected and re-elected, but the level of income, the level of wealth is still as it was 50 years ago. So we must not go for premature celebrations that, oh, we have a black president in the States, or, oh, we took the government in certain African nations, yet the people, the masses are still not to where they should be. And I think that's why we still see racism. We cannot have just symbolism. We must have the substantive rise of our people to where they are equal, not just free to participate, but free to be protected by the law. And the laws must be executed and enforced, and the opportunities, the ceiling must be lifted, not for a few, not having just one or two black billionaires in the States or in South Africa, but for the masses. Until we achieve that, we're not totally free yet.
Another issue that we look to on our continent is embracing our Pan-Africanism. And I just wonder how, you talked about the diaspora at the beginning, how we embrace a global African identity.
I think we have to embrace it because we all come from the same root, and that root is in the continent. And a tree is only as strong as its roots. You don't judge the tree by the branches or by the fruit it bears. You judge it by the root, because every season will knock branches off and will turn the fruit into something that is not desirable. But if the root is there, it will continue to grow and bring about fruit and branches. And we may be a branch in the States, some a branch in the Caribbean, some a branch in Europe, but the root is there in Africa, and that is who we are. That is our culture, that is our spirituality, that is our values, and that is what we live and should embrace. And that's the only way we can break racism, is by clearly identifying and grounding ourselves in who we are.
You've lived through some momentous times in the United States, times of change, and some things changing more slowly. I just wonder lessons that perhaps we can learn as a new nation relatively from your lived experience in the United States.
I think that the lessons that I've learned is that we must never forget the objective, which is total freedom and total equality across the board, and that we cannot have premature celebrations. Sometimes we would get a breakthrough and think, oh, that's it, and it is not it. We must judge by the goals of equality and fairness and equal protection under the law and equal opportunity. And those that we get victories along the way, we must understand that it is just victory along the way. If I was to go on a journey and got in a vehicle and had a destination, I may make several stops on the way. Some of those stops may be very enjoyable and pleasurable, but I've not reached my destination. One of the things I've learned is sometimes we celebrate at a pit stop rather than using a pit stop to energize us to continue the journey to the ultimate destination.
Well, the lecture is actually this evening at 6 p.m. on SABC News, and there's at various other SABC platforms such as the SABC News app and the SABC YouTube channel. So make sure that you tuned in this evening at 6 p.m. Let's now get to know Steve Bantu Biko as a person and explore his philosophy of black consciousness. We're now joined by Professor Saths Cooper, who worked very closely with Steve Biko in spreading the philosophy of black consciousness as a student. Now, Professor Saths Cooper is a renowned clinical psychologist and a former Robben Island prisoner. Professor, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I do understand that you met Steve Biko through campus politics. Do tell us more about how that first meeting came about and various other interactions.
Well, I was a student at the University College in Durban. It was the period where in 1968, Steve was at the medical school. It was a special medical school for all blacks that had been set up because there was no other. And it was segregated education, complete segregation in all spheres of life, sporting, educational, even newsrooms and newspapers were segregated accordingly. So it was in that period that he was involved in the SRC at the University of Natal Medical School, and I was an activist on the campus. It was a makeshift campus on the bay in what was called Salisbury Island, now Finland, in the Durban harbour. And I got to know him from that period onwards when he was having the kinds of discussions, debates within himself and with the rest of us about continuing to ignite student activism and what the purpose would be, particularly because there was no representation by blacks, for blacks, about their own condition.
Was it at that point, Professor, that you came to embrace the concept or the ideal of black consciousness and black determination and black pride? Because I understand that back in 1971, you were asked to assist the Natal Indian Congress to, urging other Indians to embrace the black consciousness ideology. What then would you make of this, ideology or school of thought by various other classes, including the Indian group, that being Indian can be stratified as being a black, not necessarily as a completely different racial group on its own?
Well, the SASO, SASO started off being part of the English-speaking student organization on campuses, NUSAS, and fairly quickly, in 68, 69, it became obvious that our interests diverged phenomenally. And the result was a black caucus was formed. And at the medical school, it was Africans, coloreds, and Indians. And there was probably a preponderance of Indian students who were medical students as well on that campus. And the majority began to realize that our solidarity was much more important. We needed to unite as black students to express issues that were common to us. And black consciousness emerged, I would say, the following year after Steve was elected on the 1st of July, 1969, as the founding president. Bani Pichana was on that executive. He followed Steve Biko as the second president, and the ideas that are now known as black consciousness emerged from that late 60s into the 70s. In 1971, there was talk of resuscitating the Natal Indian Congress, and many of us opposed that because we said, and we held a demonstration in that meeting saying we should form a People's Congress. It's divide and rule. Bantustanization has been implemented. We as intellectuals and young people are going to further divide ourselves. So we oppose the formation of the Natal Indian Congress. In asking for a mandate, its founder, Mewa Ramgobin, said, look, give me the mandate and I will look at this issue because the law prevents it. I mean, we argued that the law did not prevent it. It was our mental block and our fear that precluded black people getting together across ethnicity and so on. And a few months before the October meeting to inaugurate the NIC, I was invited to the SASO offices in Durban, where I found Steve, Bani Pichana, Harry Nengwakulu, Srini Mudli was there. and they started talking about the NIC. And I expressed my view very clearly. I said, we oppose that because we stand for all black. We cannot divide ourselves. As it is, we're divided as a country. And they looked at each other, and I realized I'm being set up here. I said, look, you guys seem to have had this discussion. So what's the point? And they said, well, we want you to go into the NIC. I said, not on your life. I argued for about an hour, and eventually Steve said, look, whether we like it or not, this will be formed, and we cannot afford, and I'll use his words, we cannot afford this charism to persist. Otherwise, black solidarity will be defeated. And reluctantly, I got into the NIC, mobilized, and ours was the largest branch. We had, at our height, 7 delegates to the NIC. And I got elected the first vice president of the NIC, despite the initial meeting where many of them said, we don't want your kind here, because we espoused black unity. We espoused the views of black consciousness. The result was my other groups, colored, Indian, joined and became active. This caused problems with the Natal Indian Congress leadership, who said, why are you enrolling others who are not Indian? And I said to them, show me any part of the Constitution which said that the Constitution restricts membership to Indian. And the discussion ended there. But in that period, December 1971, Steve, Barney, Harry Ngwakulu, Drake Corker, various other black consciousness activists had succeeded in getting the All-African Organization Conference that was held in the DOCC in Orlando to look at forming a Black People's Convention. I was elected onto that ad hoc committee, and we mobilized and created a political organization. It's unusual for students to form a mother body, but that's exactly what happened, given the fear that had engulfed South African society. The security police were everywhere. BOSS, the Bureau of State Security, had started its operations, and it was the late 80s, a period of extreme fear. People had been arrested, people were in exile, the ANC and PAC were banned. And what Mandela calls that felt fire that Biko represented hit the country and continued from that period into 72 when Tiro and the entire student body at the now University of Limpopo were expelled. Nationwide student boycotts were held. We were put on trial for celebrating the accession to power of Frelimo right next door to us. We defied the authorities at that time, and the Black consciousness message began to get credence. Remember, we had media was controlled by white interests, Afrikaner and English-speaking interests. There was no black press, as there still isn't now. The SABC was a state broadcaster. There were no other radio stations. We had no television. So we had to mobilize, and the pamphlets we wrote, the articles we wrote, ignited that. 76 happened in a period when our trial was halfway through the defense case, and Steve Biko was our main defense witness. And the
Professor,
last
may
time,
I come in there? I do beg your pardon. Do you reckon that black consciousness is still relevant today? Does it still resonate with the contemporary South African politics in the promulgation of our laws? And is there a danger, perhaps, that some racial groups will feel alienated in the in the contemporary rainbow nation, which is South Africa for everyone?
You know, in fact and law, we are. The reality is we are as divided as we've ever been. The last few months, particularly under the pandemic emergency health conditions, we've seen the outpourings of racist diatribe. We've seen people claim narrow positions. We've seen the rage and hatred. And it tells us that that elephant in the room in our houses, in the public spaces, has not been dealt with. We've been a deeply racist society outside of Nazi Germany. And that's why the UN declared South Africa with the status it did. We've been deeply racist. We've been excluded until 94. We still are, as a black majority, a political majority, but we're a minority economically. And in terms of culture, the national culture narrative, we seem to be European or American in Africa, southern tip of Africa, yet we are subsumed by that narrative. Why should we walk on eggshells when we confront our own reality? Why should we apologize for having more melanin in our pigmentation, for having a different colored, different texture of hair? Why should the shape of our noses matter? Biologically, ons is dieselfde. Siafana nje, we have the same biology, yet the external pigmentation tends to divide us. And importantly, that race classification comes from apartheid. When the Act of Union was created in 1910 from the two British protectorates and the two Boer republics, it excluded black people from any political involvement whatsoever. We now have the political kingdom, but we do not have the heights of the economy, we do not have that equality and equity, and importantly, we don't enjoy our own respect and the respect of others. So it's time to review where we are as a country, the conversation about race exclusion. Indeed, blacks being invisible, except in the negative, must change.
And as we review those conversations around blackness and racism, how would you celebrate or remember Steve Biko? How should South Africa remember Steve Biko? And in the commemoration and celebration of his legacy, should other racial groups be invited in that celebration as well?
Well, look, Sobukwe said this, that there's one a group, and that's the human race. It is important to recognize that we should not use biology to divide ourselves. We should remember the words of sitting U.S. Supreme Court Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who talks of biological traits of behavior over which the individual has no choice. We're such an abnormal society that when we go out of our country, we see normalcy and we think they are abnormal. And that's because of indoctrination. It's because of a dumbed-down education system, particularly during democracy. It's about actually allowing what Vervoet failed to do to survive. And he said there's no place for him in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor, drawers of wood, hewers of water. Vervoet has succeeded even though he failed in his lifetime. We are entrenching that endemic inferiority. And I think that the fears are artificial fears, because race is a deliberate social construct. There's no science to it whatsoever. The anthropologists who have tried have been debunked for creating a divide and rule wherever in the world. We're one humanity. That humanity began in the Great Rift Valley civilization. Early human beings from Ethiopia down to the Cape. And the oldest living ethnic group in the world is the Komani San of the southern Kalahari Desert, bordering our country, Namibia and Botswana. 96% of the world's population, not just us, the world's population, can trace their DNA to this living ethnic group. So what is it that says we must be ashamed of who we are. Reclaim who you are. Be proud that you are Basotho. Be proud that you are Zulu speaking. Be proud, if you want, that you are white or Indian. But first, you are a human being. You cannot be a language. You cannot be an ethnicity. You cannot be a gender. You cannot be a belief or a religion. You are more than that. And the more we are categorized and stuffed into little boxes, the more we will deal with the same issue over and over again. We need to out racism and its twin evil, sexism. And until we do that through our education system, change the way we think about ourselves and the other, self-respect and then other respect, we will continue to deal with the nightmares of our past, which our children, the majority who are youth, cannot afford to countenance anymore.
Cooper, thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate your analysis on this matter. It's been a great pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you.
That was Professor Saths Cooper. He worked very closely with the late Steve Biko on spreading the philosophy of black consciousness as a student back at the University College. And Professor Cooper is now a renowned clinical psychologist and a former Robben Island prisoner. And for more on the commemoration of Steve Biko, we cross live to Veteran Journalist Mathatha Tsedu. He was one of the journalists that uncovered the atrocities and injustices of apartheid. And we chat to him right now. Professor, thank you so much for joining us, and a very warm welcome to the agenda.
Hi, Stuart. I'm no longer a professor, so just so that nobody phones you to say I'm a fake professor.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying that. First of all, how significant was the role of the media during Biko's times compared to the role of media today?
I think we have to go back even before Biko's time to the time of people like Henry Ngumalo, who was really the father of investigative journalism in South Africa, whose work was not based on just interviews with people, but he would go and live the experience that he would then write. The potato boycotts, that national potato boycott that happened in the 60s was a result of him going into a farm and working there as a prisoner and experiencing what was happening, people being killed and then buried in the field so that they became... and he came back to write those stories that changed the narrative of the injustices that were happening. The Tauza experience in prison, where black men would be forced each morning to stand naked and jump up and down, would be peeping underneath to see whether they don't have some contraband stuck somewhere underneath there. That work by Henry resulted in the Prison Act, which forbade any publication of pictures or any story about prison conditions without a written permission from the commissioner. So you go back there and you realize that the media has always been writing about the atrocities. During Biko's time, there were a lot of journalists who were doing great work. People like Bokwe Mafuna, who's still alive, who walked out of the Rand Daily Mail because they to refer to black students as black and insisted on calling them non-white. And he resigned from his job and became a member of SASO because he was making this point that we have to be who we say we are. You can't call us non-something. So this is the period. This is what was happening when Steve was there. Because Bokwe, for example, walked out of the Rand Daily Mail at a SASO conference in Hammanskraal at St. Peter's Conference Center.
Now, the atrocities in Biko's times compared to the role of the media in exposing today's injustices and atrocities, what more do you think should be done, Mr. Tsedu?
I think what we have to accept is that each generation will produce the journalists that will deal with the challenges of its time. So I was speaking about Henry. There may well be instances now where on farms people are still being abused, and we have to do that. But the other challenges that face us today as a nation and that the media today has to grapple with are the issues around the corruption of freedom. And I'm not just talking about corruption. I'm talking about the corruption of freedom. Freedom is being corrupted so that it benefits a few people instead of freedom being a mechanism that benefits the majority of people. So that's the challenge that faces the media today. How do you ensure that the subversion of freedom is exposed in such a way that that whole process stops?
Now, every journalist, Mr. Tsedu, I suppose, subscribes to the principle of I write what I like by Steve Bantu Biko. So in contemporary journalism and the current crop of journalists, do you think they still live by that mantra? Do they write what they like? Do the current laws allow them to do so?
Yeah, much more than back then, even what I would euphemistically call our time, when the stories that you had to do, for example, around the army and the police had to be vetted by the Bureau of State Security, and if they said, no, you can't say this, you wouldn't be able to write it. You would have to find different ways of getting the information out. Today, those challenges are not there. People are free to write, and there's a tendency amongst people with grey beard like me who want to say, you know, during our time we did much better than everybody else. If you look at the media today, you will realize that the media is fulfilling its functions to the hilt today, because we know what is happening, and that is really what the role of media is, to ensure that people are properly informed so that they can make their important decisions about their lives from an informed position. And if you look at the kind of stories that are happening, the existence of the Zondo Commission, for example, is a result of a lot of media work that was done that highlighted those things, leading to the public protector saying a commission must be appointed and the president eventually appointing that commission. So, yes, people are doing what they can. The circumstances are different. The media economics are becoming extremely difficult, so there are less people to do a lot more.
Now, just a short while ago, I had a conversation with Professor Saths Cooper, who worked very closely with Steve Biko, whom he met at the University College through university politics. And I asked him about whether, you know, the narrative of black consciousness and black self-determination is still relevant in contemporary South Africa, and whether that would, in a way, and essentially alienate other racial groups. Because the assumption is that we live in one South Africa, the rainbow nation. And Mr. Cooper said, well, that shouldn't be the case, because there is only one human race. There's only one race, which is the human race. Your thoughts?
Black consciousness as a philosophy that is rooted in the commonness of humanity, but which also says to black people, love yourself more, because you're starting from a minus position. You have to fight to be human. And then once you attain that status of being human, you must then defend it. So the concept of black consciousness as a philosophy is much more relevant today, because it is rooted in the love for yourself, for your people. And if we all embody that, we wouldn't be having all these bannings of clinics because somebody wants a road, or banning of schools because you want to belong to a different municipality. All the kind of nonsense or madness that seems to have gripped the black community to a very large extent wouldn't exist if we all had internalized the ethos of black consciousness. And it is needed now more than even at the time of Steve Biko. And you can see it with the stuff around fees must fall, roads must fall. It's a reassession of the value of blackness and the need to actually accept it as the supreme definer of who we are as people.
And having said that, Mr. Tsedu, some believe that speaking a white language, English in particular, and speaking it in a certain way and in a particular accent is a measure of intelligence. Are those who believe in that school of thought actually turning their backs on the principle of black determination and black consciousness?
Yeah. Steve would have called them non-whites, even if they looked not white. He would have called them non-whites because blackness was not just about pigmentation, it was about your social, cultural, and legal position, and most importantly, your determination to say, I'm uniting myself with the rest of the oppressed so that we can bring this system down and our own humanity as people is accepted. Now, when you think what people call a Model C accent is the thing to do or the thing to be, you have lost all of that. You have become what was called a non-white, and the non-white was really somebody who would want to be white, but cannot physically be so because they don't look white. So irrespective of how much they try to speak like white, they would never become white, and therefore they would remain non-white.
Just before I let you go, Mr. Tsedu, South African media in particular has been labelled as a very liberal media, especially on the continent. And having said that, should South African media be viewed through the lens of being a panacea for media freedom? And what's the state of media freedom on the continent? Well,
it is not easy to give an overall answer for the whole continent and say this is the state of media freedom on the continent. There are pockets of supreme repression on our continent. Places like Eritrea, Zimbabwe is one of those examples right now. Ethiopia. There are many countries where journalists are in jail, and that's a blot. But there are also many other places where media used to be just state-owned, and there is now a plethora of independently owned television stations, radio stations, and newspapers that are telling the stories of their countries without interference from governments.
All right, Mr. Tsedu, thank you so much for your analysis. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, that was veteran journalist Mathatha Tsedu speaking us on the line on the legacy of Steve Biko, as today marks 43 years since he was murdered.